The contrast was when we did Star Wars, nobody cared. You know, I read it and I gave it to my friend to read. I said that this is the goofiest thing I've ever read. He called and he said, "Can I give it to Meredith?" I said, "Sure." I passed it all around. Nobody cared.
Before the multi-billion-dollar empire, the toys, and the cinematic legacy, there was just a chaotic, low-budget sci-fi flick that everyone expected to bomb.
The first three are really, that I'm writing now, are really about Skywalker. He's just always in a black suit. But you don't know how he fell from grace, the trauma that went through to get him to there, and then his son brings him back. But in the real story hasn't even been told yet.
The set was a disaster zone of melting props, political standoffs, and a director on the verge of a literal medical breakdown. You think you know Star Wars? Think again. Beneath the polished surface of a galaxy far, far away lies a history of bizarre accidents and wild choices. Let's look at the strange reality behind the masterpiece, the bluish-gray Wookiee prototype. Long before Chewbacca became the towering, lovable walking carpet we all know and adore, he looked like something pulled straight out of a surrealist sci-fi nightmare. When George Lucas was first dreaming up his space opera, he knew he needed a loyal, non-human co-pilot for Han Solo, but he didn't quite know what a Wookiee actually looked like. To bring this alien companion to life, he turned to the legendary concept artist Ralph McQuarrie. What McQuarrie turned in was radically different from the gentle, furry giant that eventually graced the silver screen. The original design depicted Chewbacca as a lean, agile creature with smooth, bluish-gray skin, massive, glowing eyes, and giant, expressive ears that made him look remarkably like a giant, hairless lemur or a genetically modified bush baby. Instead of wearing a simple bandolier, this prototype Wookiee was fully clothed in a sleek, futuristic flak jacket and chrome armor pieces, brandishing a high-tech rifle that felt much more like traditional 70s pulp sci-fi than the lived-in fantasy aesthetic Star Wars eventually pioneered. While Lucas ultimately decided that Han's co-pilot needed to be much shaggier, warmer, and more animalistic, partially inspired by his own massive Alaskan Malamute dog, Indiana. This strange, bald alien design didn't just vanish into the Lucasfilm archives. Decades later, executive producer Dave Filoni dug up McQuarrie's original, unused bluish-gray artwork and used it as the direct visual blueprint to create the character of Zeb Orrelios in the animated series Star Wars Rebels. So, while the 1977 movie gave us the furry icon we love, the original, eerie prototype was just waiting in the shadows for its turn in the spotlight. But a creepy, hairless Chewbacca was nothing compared to the international incident brewing in the deserts of North Africa. The Tunisian military scare. Filming in the Tunisian desert felt less like making a movie and more like surviving a geopolitical crisis. To serve as the mobile fortress for the Jawa scavengers, the crew constructed a massive, heavy-duty prop of the Sandcrawler. It was a mechanical behemoth towering over the desert flats. The problem was its location. The set sat remarkably close to the border of Libya, a nation then ruled by the highly volatile and heavily armed dictator Muammar Gaddafi. When Libyan military reconnaissance spotted this gargantuan, industrial-looking tracked vehicle sitting just across their border, they immediately panicked. The Libyan government assumed the Tunisian military was covertly deploying a terrifying, state-of-the-art prototype war machine right on their doorstep. Tensions spiked instantly. Gaddafi's regime issued a fierce, formal threat to the Tunisian government, warning that they would launch an immediate, full-scale military mobilization unless this mysterious vehicle was dismantled or moved away. Terrified of sparking a literal international border war over a low-budget space movie, Tunisian officials rushed to the set. They practically begged George Lucas to move the Sandcrawler to a less provocative location. Lucas complied, quickly shifting production schedules to avoid a massive military strike, proving that making science fiction in 1977 carried some incredibly real high-stakes dangers. The junkyard lightsaber. The elegant weapon of a Jedi Knight is easily one of the most famous pieces of iconography in cinematic history. You would naturally assume that a weapon so central to the lore was meticulously designed over months by specialized Hollywood craftsmen. In reality, Luke Skywalker's original lightsaber was an absolute piece of junk, hastily cobbled together from spare parts found in the bottom of a photography bargain bin. Set decorator Roger Christian was tasked with building the props on a shoestring budget. While exploring a vintage camera shop in London, he discovered a box of old Graflex flash gun tubes from the 40s. The metallic handles used to hold large flash bulbs on old-school press cameras. Christian instantly recognized the sleek, futuristic potential of the chrome cylinders. To transform the camera gear into a sci-fi weapon, he bought the handles for mere pocket change, glued rubber grips cut from British windshield wiper blades along the base, and attached a small piece of plastic tracking from a display cabinet to serve as the control switch. A vintage bubble strip from an old Texas Instruments calculator was jammed into the clasp to add a bit of tech texture. The result was pure movie magic born from absolute thrift, proving you don't need a massive budget to create an eternal pop culture legend. The studio executive tears. By the time production wrapped, almost nobody believed in George Lucas's weird little space movie. The crew thought it was silly, the special effects house was months behind schedule, and the board of directors at 20th Century Fox was actively looking for an excuse to pull the plug. Only one man stood between Star Wars and total cancellation. A studio executive named Alan Ladd Jr. Ladd was fascinated not by the sci-fi concept, but by Lucas's sheer passion. He shielded the director from the furious studio board, risking his entire career on a project everyone else considered a guaranteed financial disaster. When a rough cut of the film was finally assembled, Lucas held a private screening for Ladd and a few nervous executives. The cut was highly incomplete, featuring missing special effects and temporary footage of World War II dogfights filling in for the space battles. As the lights came up, Lucas braced himself for the worst. Instead, he looked over and saw Alan Ladd Jr. sitting in the dark, visibly weeping. The executive wasn't crying out of regret. He was completely overwhelmed by the emotional core of the story. Ladd looked at the exhausted director and told him it was the greatest movie he had ever seen, single-handedly saving the film from being butchered by panicked studio bosses. The trash compactor stink. Filming the famous Death Star trash compactor scene was a miserable experience for everyone involved, mostly because the garbage wasn't acting. To make the scene look authentic, the crew gathered actual, filthy debris and mixed it with water that sat stagnant under the hot studio lights for days. The resulting stench was so foul that the actors could barely breathe without gagging. Mark Hamill held his breath for so long during the drowning sequence that he actually burst a blood vessel in his face, forcing the camera crew to shoot the rest of the scene from carefully angled perspectives to hide the injury. Meanwhile, Peter Mayhew's heavy, woolen Chewbacca suit absorbed the toxic, stinky water like a giant sponge. The damp fabric became incredibly heavy and began to rot right on his body, radiating a horrific smell that contaminated the entire soundstage. Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford spent hours wading through the lukewarm sludge, swathing themselves in towels between takes just to escape the putrid atmosphere. When Lucas finally yelled "cut" on the final day, the cast fled the set, leaving behind a ruined, foul-smelling swamp that the cleanup crew had to sanitize using industrial-grade deodorizers. Yoda was almost a literal monkey. While Yoda doesn't debut until The Empire Strikes Back, the development of the iconic Jedi Master began heavily during the final stages of the 1977 film's aftermath. George Lucas desperately wanted a character who defied traditional alien tropes, but his initial pre-production plan was wildly different from the puppet we know today. Lucas seriously considered casting a real-life, trained chimpanzee to play the role of Yoda. The plan was to dress the live monkey in a tiny, custom-tailored Jedi robe, place a realistic latex mask over its face, and hand it a small cane to walk with. Production teams even began scouting animal talent agencies to find a primate intelligent enough to follow complex directions on set. Fortunately, a crew member who had previously worked on Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey stepped in with a reality check. They pointed out that a masked chimpanzee would inevitably grow frustrated, rip the mask off, and become completely unmanageable under the hot studio lights. Realizing a live animal would cause absolute chaos, Lucas abandoned the idea and eventually collaborated with Jim Henson's team to create the masterful animatronic puppet instead. The disco-charged editing save. The thrilling, high-stakes Death Star trench run that audiences cheered for in theaters almost didn't exist. In the original rough cut, assembled by the film's first editor, the entire climax was a total disaster. The pacing was sluggish, the stakes felt incredibly low, and the dogfights lacked any sense of geographical orientation or genuine tension. Realizing his movie was about to fail at the finish line, George Lucas fired the original editor and handed the footage over to his wife, Marcia Lucas. She completely restructured the final battle from scratch in the editing room, inventing a frantic, ticking clock narrative mechanism that wasn't even in the shooting script. To give the sequence a dynamic, driving rhythm before the actual orchestral score was recorded, Marcia used dynamic temporary tracks, including upbeat disco music, to time the cuts perfectly to the action. She spliced together tight close-ups of the pilots, quick reaction shots of Darth Vader, and explosive laser fire to build an escalating sense of dread. Her brilliant mastery of pacing single-handedly transformed a disjointed mess of special effects into one of the most suspenseful climaxes in cinema history. Anthony Daniels' blind agony, putting on the shiny gold armor of C-3PO, didn't make Anthony Daniels feel like a sci-fi star. It felt like entering a medieval torture device. The suit was constructed from rigid, sharp fiberglass that bit into his skin every time he moved. On the very first day of filming in the scorching heat of Tunisia, the left leg piece actually shattered, splintering inward and deeply stabbing him in the shin. Worse than the physical pain was the near-total sensory deprivation. The eyes of the golden mask were backed by tiny gold-plated meshes, which reduced Daniel's vision to practically zero. He couldn't see his feet, meaning he had to memorize the terrain before walking to avoid tripping over hidden cables or falling into ditches. The helmet also muffled his hearing, leaving him isolated inside a stifling, metallic prison. Because it took hours to assemble the suit piece by piece, the crew often left Daniels standing in costume during short production breaks. He was completely unable to sit down, eat, or drink without a massive crew intervention. He stood alone in the desert, ignored by crew members who treated him like a prop, enduring absolute agony to bring the protocol droid to life. But the true genius of the movie lay in turning these painful, chaotic practical realities into sights and sounds that felt completely out of this world. The snacks sound of TIE fighters. When sound designer Ben Burtt was tasked with creating the auditory universe of Star Wars, he eschewed the predictable route of using futuristic electronic synthesizers or computerized tone generators. Instead, he preferred to hunt down organic, real-world noises that could be warped, layered, and distorted into something completely alien. The terrifying, screaming roar of an Imperial TIE fighter is widely considered one of his greatest achievements, yet its creative origin is delightfully bizarre. To achieve that iconic metallic shriek, Burtt blended a specific animal recording with a completely mundane environmental sound effect. The heavy core of the sound is actually a pitched-down, frantic scream of a baby elephant charging at a zoo. However, the elephant trumpet alone lacked the cold, high-speed aerodynamic edge required for a terrifying starfighter. To fix this, Burtt mixed in the audio track of his own car driving fast down a completely drenched, rain-slicked highway. The tires cutting through the water at high speed created a distinct tearing swoosh. When stretched, heavily equalized, and acoustic shifted together, these two entirely unrelated noises perfectly simulated the sound of a twin-ion engine ripping through the vacuum of space, forever altering cinema audio design. James Earl Jones left his name off. It is practically impossible to imagine Darth Vader without the deep, menacing, operatic resonance provided by James Earl Jones. Yet, When audiences sat in theaters in May 1977, Jones's name was completely missing from the rolling end credits. This wasn't an intentional snub by George Lucas or a careless mistake by the studio. It was a deliberate, highly principled choice made by the legendary actor himself. At the time, David Prowse was the physical actor inside the heavy armor, enduring the stifling heat and performing the physical blocking on set. Jones was brought in late during post-production simply to dub over Prowse's high-pitched British accent. Because of this, Jones viewed his vocal contribution merely as a minor post-production pickup, or an audio special effect track, rather than a full, legitimate acting performance. Out of deep respect for Prowse's grueling physical work inside the suit, and fearing that a separate voice credit would ruin the terrifying mystique of the villain, Jones strictly requested that his name be left off the theatrical release entirely, remaining uncredited for his world-altering performance until Return of the Jedi finally hit theaters years later. The micro-model bowling alley. The terrifying, planet-destroying Death Star looked absolutely massive on the silver screen, but the physical reality was a miniature triumph of absolute thrift and tedious manual labor. Industrial Light and Magic did not possess the computing power to render the space station's vast, metallic surface digitally, so model makers constructed massive, flat wooden tables covered in millions of tiny plastic pieces. This intricate technique, known in the industry as kit bashing, involved buying thousands of commercial model kits, everything from World War II battleships and tanks to commercial airplanes, and gluing the tiny parts together to create a complex industrial landscape. The massive surface model took up a huge portion of the warehouse floor, looking like a highly detailed gray bowling alley lane. Because the model was so intricate and delicate, dust was a constant enemy that would ruin the illusion of cosmic scale on camera. To keep the miniature battle station pristine, crew members had to walk gingerly along the edges of the tables daily with a literal gas-powered leaf blower, blasting dust and loose debris away before the cameras could roll for the day's special effects shots. Harrison Ford's $1,000 paycheck. Harrison Ford is now the ultimate cinematic icon of galactic swagger, but back in 1976, he was barely considered an actor by George Lucas. In fact, Lucas was completely dead set against casting anyone from his previous film, American Graffiti, because he wanted entirely fresh faces for his space opera. Ford was only brought onto the project as a favor to casting director Fred Roos, tasked strictly with standing in to read lines during screen tests with hundreds of other young actors auditioning for the roles of Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia. As week after week of auditions dragged on, Ford became increasingly annoyed by the repetitive, overly theatrical lines he had to read. He began delivering Han Solo's dialogue with a sarcastic, cynical, and biting real-world edge that perfectly captured the essence of a gritty space smuggler. Lucas eventually looked past his own casting rule and realized the perfect Han Solo had been sitting right in front of him the entire time. However, since Ford was still an unproven commodity to 20th Century Fox executives, he was signed to a meager contract that paid him just $1,000 per week during the grueling shoot. Adjusted for inflation, it was still a remarkably low salary for a lead character in a major studio film. Ford swallowed his pride, took the tiny paycheck, and delivered a legendary performance that permanently launched him into Hollywood's multi-million-dollar stratosphere. The boring opening scroll struggle, that iconic yellow text crawling upward into the infinite starfield, is now the ultimate cinematic signature of a Star Wars film. But it was originally an unreadable roadblock that nearly ruined the movie's opening minutes. George Lucas knew his audience would need some immediate political context to understand the galaxy, so he drafted a massive, dense narrative prologue. Unfortunately, Lucas's first draft of the crawl was a complete and utter disaster. It was written in a highly clinical, overly complicated bureaucratic language that read more like a boring textbook on interstellar trade routes than an exciting space adventure. When Lucas held a private screening of the rough cut for a small group of his close filmmaking peers, the The room grew dead silent during the opening sequence. Brian De Palma, a director known for his blunt honesty, practically threw his hands up in frustration. He told Lucas that the opening crawl was completely incomprehensible, went on far too long, and would put audiences to sleep before they even saw a starship. Taking the harsh critique to heart, Lucas sat down with De Palma right then and there to fix it. De Palma helped slash the bloated paragraphs down to a sleek 3-paragraph punch of pure narrative adrenaline, turning a boring wall of text into a legendary piece of pop culture history. But rewriting a few paragraphs of text was nothing compared to the bizarre, uncomfortable rules governing the wardrobe of the Galactic Rebellion. The gaffer tape wardrobe malfunctions. When Carrie Fisher stepped onto the set to play Princess Leia Organa, she was shocked to discover that her flowing white costume came with a highly unexpected mandatory rule. George Lucas flatly informed her that she was strictly forbidden from wearing a traditional brassiere underneath her dress. When a baffled Fisher asked for a logical explanation, Lucas offered a bizarre piece of sci-fi philosophy. He claimed that there was absolutely no underwear in space, arguing that a human body would expand in zero gravity while a bra would contract, ultimately strangling the person wearing it. Since the flimsy white fabric of the gown was practically translucent under the incredibly bright, hot studio lights of the soundstage, leaving things completely natural was simply not a viable option for a major Hollywood production. To solve this delicate wardrobe dilemma, without breaking Lucas's strange cosmic rule, the wardrobe department had to get incredibly creative. They resorted to using layers of heavy-duty, industrial gaffer tape to bind Fisher's chest tightly beneath the dress. Fisher later joked that she spent the entire production feeling like an absolute hostage to adhesive tape, enduring itchy skin, painful removal sessions, and constant sweat, proving that looking like galactic royalty required some seriously unglamorous sacrifices. The Cantina aliens were Halloween leftovers. The Mos Eisley Cantina sequence is famous for introducing audiences to a wretched hive of scum and villainy, packed to the brim with some of the most diverse, exotic alien life ever seen on film. You would naturally think that every single creature in that dark space bar was the product of months of meticulous design and high-end prosthetic engineering. The truth, however, is that a shocking number of those iconic aliens were actually cheap, off-the-shelf Halloween masks bought from a local costume shop at the absolute last minute. During the primary shoot in London, Lucas felt that the initial Cantina footage looked incredibly sparse, boring, and completely lacked the crowded, bustling energy of a cosmopolitan spaceport. Because the budget was already entirely depleted, makeup designer Stuart Freeborn couldn't afford to sculpt dozens of brand-new creature faces from scratch. Instead, he rushed out and purchased a variety of mass-produced rubber masks, including pre-existing werewolf and devil designs, and subtly altered them with bits of paint, extra fur, and glass eyes. These cheap masks were then quickly placed on extras, sitting in the dark, smoky background shadows of the booths, cleverly disguising their mundane earthly origins and saving the scene through pure, low-budget desperation. The $11 million breakdown. By the middle of 1976, the crushing weight of the production was slowly destroying George Lucas's physical health. The film's budget had ballooned to a then massive $11 million. The special effects crew at Industrial Light and Magic had spent half their budget but only completed a handful of usable shots, and the studio board at Fox was constantly threatening to shut him down. Lucas found himself trapped in a nightmare of endless technical failures, uncooperative English crews who refused to work past tea time, and actors who openly mocked his dialogue. The relentless stress eventually manifested as a severe medical crisis. One morning, Lucas woke up with terrifying, crushing pains in his chest and absolute difficulty breathing. Convinced he was suffering a massive heart failure at just 32 years old, he was rushed to a local hospital. Doctors thoroughly examined the exhausted filmmaker and diagnosed him not with a heart attack, but with severe hypertension and exhaustion caused by acute, chronic stress. They strongly advised him to immediately walk away from the film and rest. Lucas, however, was far too obsessed to quit. He ignored the medical warnings and walked right back onto the chaotic set, firmly believing he was killing himself to complete an absolute cinematic failure. Chewbacca's voice is a zoo remix. When audiences hear Chewbacca express his frustration or joy, they are hearing one of the most recognizable vocal tracks in film history. Yet, Peter Mayhew never made a single sound that made it into the final movie. On set, he simply spoke his lines in a muffled British growl to give the other actors cues. The true voice of the Wookiee was engineered entirely in post-production by sound wizard Ben Burt, who spent months recording real animals at various zoos and wildlife preserves to create a completely unique acoustic palette. Burt quickly discovered that no single animal possessed the emotional range required for a complex character like Chewbacca. To fix this, he carefully constructed a massive audio library of specific animal vocalizations, primarily relying on the deep, mournful groans of a black bear named Tarik. To add nuances of anger, fear, or confusion, Burt painstakingly spiced the bear tracks with the high-pitched, watery grunts of walruses, the sharp barks of badgers, and the raspy chuffs of sick lions. He then sat at a console, manually cutting and pasting individual syllables from different animals together to form a brand new, entirely synthetic language that perfectly matched the physical performance of the gentle giant on screen. The Deke Starkiller script chaos. The tight, mythic narrative structure of the original Star Wars film is often studied as a masterclass in clean, effective storytelling. However, that polished narrative was carved out of an absolute mountain of incomprehensible script drafts that read like a totally different franchise. In Lucas's chaotic early treatments, the central protagonist wasn't a young farm boy named Luke Skywalker, but a grizzled, elderly general named Luke Starkiller, while the primary hero was actually a young warrior named Deke. Han Solo wasn't a charming, cynical human smuggler either, who belonged to a bizarre species called the Uruks. Furthermore, the mystical concept of the Force was barely integrated, and lightsabers weren't the exclusive, elegant weapons of the Jedi Knights. Instead, laser swords were common sidearms carried by ordinary Imperial stormtroopers and low-level space pirates alike. Lucas spent multiple years radically rewriting the manuscript, constantly throwing away hundreds of pages of intricate world-building because his friends told him the story was a confusing mess, proving that the galaxy's greatest story was saved by a brutal, non-stop process of creative trial and error. The May the 4th political origin. The famous phrase, "May the 4th be with you," is celebrated globally every single year by millions of fans as the ultimate, definitive holiday for the entire franchise. You would naturally assume that this incredibly clever, pun-based marketing slogan was cooked up by a high-priced public relations team working deep within the corporate offices of Lucasfilm. In reality, the legendary slogan didn't even originate within the film industry, nor was it created to celebrate the movie itself. Instead, it made its very first public appearance in the rigid, hyper-serious world of British politics. On May 4th, 1979, just 2 years after the film originally shattered box office records, Margaret Thatcher won a historic election to become the very first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. To celebrate her monumental political victory, her political party, the Conservatives, purchased a large, formal advertisement space in the London Evening News newspaper. The ad featured a supportive message directed at the new Prime Minister, reading, "May the 4th be with you, Maggie. Congratulations." Star Wars fans immediately spotted the brilliant pop culture reference, and the phrase rapidly evolved from a British political greeting into a massive, globally recognized annual celebration of the space opera. But a weird political coincidence was nothing compared to the literal million-dollar gamble that happened between two legendary directors over a plate of food. The percentage bet with Spielberg. In late 1976, George Lucas was a complete nervous wreck. Exhausted from the chaotic production, he took a short break to visit his close friend, director Steven Spielberg, who was currently filming his own high-budget science fiction masterpiece, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. When Lucas stepped onto Spielberg's pristine, highly organized, and massive indoor studio set, he immediately panicked. Looking at the beautiful practical effects and the sleek execution, Lucas became entirely convinced that his own space movie was a cheap, ugly disaster that would completely flop at the box office. In a fit of absolute despair, Lucas looked at Spielberg and declared that Close Encounters was going to be the biggest movie of all time, vastly outperforming Star Wars. Spielberg strongly disagreed, sensing that Lucas was sitting on something truly revolutionary. Seizing the moment of panic, Lucas made a wild proposition. He offered to trade 2.5% of the profits of Star Wars in exchange for 2.5% of the profits of Close Encounters. Spielberg eagerly agreed to the friendly wager, signing on to the percentage swap. Decades later, that single panic-fueled gamble continues to pay out millions of dollars directly to Spielberg annually, proving to be the most lucrative accidental bet in Hollywood history. That was a wild ride. Star Wars 1977 wasn't just a cinematic triumph, it was a miraculous survival story of a film that fought through broken props, political standoffs, and absolute chaos just to reshape pop culture forever. The next time you see Luke look out at that twin sunset, remember the stinky mud, the gaffer tape, and the leaf blowers that made the magic possible. If you loved diving into these weird, forgotten corners of movie history, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next deep dive into the bizarre realities behind your favorite films.